Hi everyone, this is a quick video to walk you through how to configure authentication in the Eos Online Subsystem plugin. So I've got my Unreal Engine project here. It's already been set up with the core configuration as in the other video guide. So what we're going to do now is we're going to set up authentication. So if we go over to the web page, this is the primary reference for all of the authentication options. And what we're going to do is we're just going to open up our Unreal Engine project here. We're just going to open up in a text editor. In this case, I'm going to use Visual Studio Code. Now, if you've gone through the configuration guide in the other video, you should have something similar to this. And what we're going to do now is we're going to start setting up the authentication options. So the first authentication option you have is the authentication behavior. And this basically dictates how the login flow is going to work in your game. The first option that you have for this is EAS required, which basically means that players have to have an Epic Games account in order to log into your game. You'll be able to access the EAS friends lists, and you'll also be able to set presence information on the user's Epic account. So when you have EAS required, either the game will sign into an Epic account using like Steam credentials if they have Steam linked with their Epic account, or the user will get an interactive prompt, so they'll get like their web browser popping up, or if you're on a console, they'll have to put a device code in. So that's the first option, that's EAS required. The next option is EAS optional. So this will try to sign into an Epic Games account automatically through, say, Steam or console, if possible. And then it will try to sign in with just Steam. So for example, with no Epic Games account attached. If it can't do any form of like automatic sign in, if there's no way to just log the user in without prompting, then it will prompt for an Epic Games sign in. So this is, typically, say for example, if you have a game where you're selling it, say on itch and on Steam, if you use EAS optional, you'll be able to automatically sign people in on Steam, where obviously the account is present. Whereas like itch, for example, that doesn't have like an account system that works like that, users will get the prompt to sign in to an Epic Games account, so they're actually signing into an account of some kind. And once the user signed in, like if they're signed in through Steam, for example, they'll also be able to link that account back with their Epic Games account. And this is useful so that, for example, players can take their saved data across platforms. And finally, the last option is no EAS. So if you don't want to use Epic Games accounts at all, or if you don't have it enabled in the developer portal, then this option basically says, sign in with the built-in authentication like Steam, Discord, that sort of thing. Then basically one of two things happens, and it depends on whether or not you've enabled anonymous authentication. Now, because you don't have Epic Games enabled, there's no way to do like an interactive login prompt. There's no neutral, login prompt that we can show. So if you don't have anonymous authentication enabled and you can't log in with Steam or any of the automatic logins, then the login just fails. Like you don't have any credentials and there's no way to prompt the user, so that it just doesn't work. If you do have anonymous authentication enabled, then it will basically create a profile for the user that is specific to the device that they're playing on. And that means, obviously because it's tied to the device, it means that players can't bring their saved data across devices. If their device ever gets lost or reset, then they're going to lose their save data. So that's something to keep in mind when you have anonymous authentication. So let's say, for example, we want to set the authentication behavior to EAS optional. We're just going to go and grab this authentication behavior from the config here. I'm going to go into default engine.ini in our project, and we're just going to change the option to EAS optional, like that. So that's configuring the authentication behavior. There's a few extra settings that you can also set to control how authentication works in your game. So as just mentioned, there is anonymous authentication. Typically you will want to use this on sort of like mobile devices where you might want to get the player into the game straight away and then let them link an account later. So if you want to allow anonymous authentication, you can use allowed device ID accounts. So if you just, again, copy this, paste it in there, now anonymous authentication will be turned on in your game. You can also tell the authentication system to delete all of the associated data for the device profile when you call logout in the game. This is typically used if you're like debugging, for example, and you want to reset the account to just get a blank anonymous account for testing purposes. You wouldn't really ever use this in an actual production game, but it's there for debugging if you need it. If you're using Epic Games logins in your game, so for example, if you're using EAS required or EAS optional, by default, the plugin will basically enable persistent login. So what that means is when a player comes and plays your game for the first time, they'll get the interactive Epic Games prompt, but then the credentials will basically be persisted. So the next time they launch the game, they won't have to log in. It'll just remember their login. You can turn that off. You can turn persistence off by using disable persistent login setting. So if you just put that in, again, in the config file like so, now it won't remember the credentials and users will have to sign in each time. So when you're developing your game and you want to test the online behavior, especially if you want to test between multiple users, you won't want to be going through the whole login process every single time. You don't want to have to go and do that interactive prompt each time. So Eos provides a developer authentication tool, which you can use to basically set up credentials for different play-in editor instances. For example, I've got the project open here, or the example project open. If you have 2 players, for example, the authentication tool basically lets you have each of these windows automatically log in as a different user. So to use the developer authentication tool, first of all, you need to have the SDK downloaded. So if you download the SDK from the Epic Games developer portal, and then you extract it somewhere, underneath SDK, tools, and then you'll find this zip file here, which will be the Eos Dev Authentication Tool. I've already extracted it, so I can just run it from here. Now for the port, you want to enter 6300, which is the port that the plugin checks for by default. And now you're going to have this blank window with no credentials in it. The dev tool doesn't remember credentials across restart, so every time you launch the dev tool, you will have to log in to the credentials again. So I'm just going to quickly do a login here. So once you've done your login, you'll get this prompt for the credential name. So for the first play-in editor instance, that will use context_1, capital C, no spaces. So we save that, and then we'll do our second login. This is for the second play-in editor window. And now what we're going to do is we're going to call this context_2 for the second play-in editor window. So now when we go back here and we click play, so we've got number of players set to 2. We're going to set both of these to EAS required. If you set, if you still have it on no EAS, then it won't try to use the dev tool. But we're going to have them both set to EAS required. And if we click login here, we can see this is going to sign in as our second account. And if we log in over here, we can see that it signs in as our first account. And these basically sign in without you having to do any prompts. And if we stop, for example, we run it again, we can hit login on each of these. And again, they sign in each to their respective accounts.